All right, and we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to my channel. For this week's live stream, I'm taking a break from the red pill content and getting back to some good old-fashioned libertarianism and talking about a subject that I'm sure will rattle everyone's boots in one way or another, Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. Now, I'm joined by my co-host, Night Shift 10,000. Say hello.
What's up?
Hey, and I gotta say, I am someone who loves military history and American military history in particular. I've read quite a bit on the subject, and I have always loved the Civil War for a lot of reasons. But I think when it comes to discussions of freedom and individual liberty, the Civil War is an important talking point, specifically because it has been used as propaganda by the ruling elites to justify a lot of the curtailment of individual rights, states' rights, individual rights, and the taking away of American liberties at every measure. Now, I find it funny. I'm actually going to put this quote up on the screen. Jonathan O, we've barely started, and he says, Abraham Lincoln ended slavery.
Oh, that's loaded.
Yeah, that's a loaded statement, to be sure. I hope that everyone who comes, certainly, I'm going to say before we get started, I'm sure everyone has very strong feelings about the Civil War. Most people do, especially if you were raised in the Southern United States. No, I was not raised in the Southern United States, but I do live in the Southern United States now. And I think it is very, if you believe in freedom and individual liberty and that the government is totalitarian and ought not be totalitarian, you need to understand who Abraham Lincoln really was and the role he played in bringing the American government to where it is today. So before we get started here, I would like to summarize kind of what I remember being taught about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War growing up in school, and then I'm going to give Night Shift an opportunity to do the same. And I'm sure many of you watching will probably tell a similar story, although, I'll be watching the comments. If anyone heard something different, feel free to let me know. But essentially, I remember in elementary school growing up, being taught that Abraham Lincoln was a humble individual born in a simple log cabin who growing up had a very hard life and learned to work very hard. And sometime when he was a teenager, he visited Louisiana and he saw people being sold as slaves. And he said, that's not right. That's unfair. And it's un-American. And I can't stand that. And Abraham Lincoln just hated the idea that black people could be enslaved just because of the color of their skin. And he knew that it was going to be his mission in life to somehow put an end to this. So he entered politics and he rose through the ranks, and he had a couple of false starts, ultimately becoming president of the United States and declaring, it is time I shall use my presidential power to finally free the Negro and end the cruel practice of slavery. To which the Southern United States said, we love slavery. We're not giving it up. We're going to fight you, Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln said, if it's a war that you want, and you will get it for whatever it takes to end slavery. And after many years of cruelty and carnage that took place in the United States, at long last, Abraham Lincoln achieved his goal. Partway through the war, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, unilaterally freeing all the slaves at once. And when all was said and done, a cruel, racist slave owner named John shot him in the back of the head, and we lost a great American hero. But we'll always remember Lincoln, the man who truly believed in equality of the races and ended American slavery. Now, Grant, is that exactly what I was taught? Not necessarily the teachers used those words, but that is definitely the narrative that I walked away with and for a long time believed. Night Shift, what was your experience learning about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War?
My experience was very much the same. Abraham Lincoln, he was a young man. He had humble beginnings, but he saw the cruelty of slavery, and he rose through the ranks, and he became president. And ultimately, he was the great emancipator, and he was, he cared about the black man. He cared about the African Americans who were trapped in the horrible bondages of the South and of slavery. And yeah, it was more or less the same. It was like he fought the war to end slavery and to be the great emancipating hero of all of America and to lead America into a new and brighter tomorrow. And it was all lies. It was all lies. It was honestly all lies. The slave, he did not care about the slaves. He did not care about the black slaves. He did not care about that at all. It was an excuse and I learned this later. I learned this the hard way because I actually believed it. I thought he was a great hero. I thought he was a great man. He did not care about them. He did not care about them one bit. And I learned that the hard way. And ultimately the whole thing was an excuse to keep the South from seceding. That was what it was all about. But yes, my experience was more or less the same as yours. That, he was a great American. He was one of the greatest presidents ever. And he was the great emancipating hero of all of America. So it was more or less the same.
So before we get started, what I'm going to say is that I did not label this stream debunking Lincoln propaganda. The reason is the biggest lie about Abraham Lincoln is I believe to be a lie of omission. Now, a lie of omission is when you don't technically say anything false, but you only tell part of the truth so as to create a false impression of what was really going on. For example, suppose you are a student in high school and you go into the bathroom, you use the bathroom, and then you smoke a cigarette, knowing that it is against the rules to smoke cigarettes in school. You then come out and are confronted by a teacher who says, "What were you doing in the bathroom?" You respond by saying, "I went to the bathroom." Was that a lie? Well, technically, no, you did in fact use the bathroom, but of course, the teacher in that circumstance is inquiring whether or not you broke the rules, which you did. And in that case, you only told part of the truth so as to create a false impression about what really is going on. And that's what's happening with Abraham Lincoln here. One only needs to read Abraham Lincoln's own words on the subject throughout the entirety of his life to learn that Abraham Lincoln was unquestionably a white supremacist. He did not believe that blacks were equal to whites. At best, he did not want to end slavery, but rather wanted to send free blacks and then send them back to Africa. And more importantly, his primary goal in ascending to the presidency had nothing to do with ending Southern slavery. It had to do with expanding the role of the federal government, specifically for what his previous party, the Whig Party, wanted, which was to increase the power of government to monkey with the economy in order to enrich themselves and their politically connected cronies. Now, there's a lot more to be said on the subject, but for those watching in the comments section, I just posted a link to Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. You can read it for yourself. When he assumes the presidency, he says clearly and unequivocally he has no intention of ending Southern slavery, but if any state has to get away with not paying its taxes, you got another thing coming. That's basically coming up. So, So we're going to watch this video from Prager U. And again, I don't think anything they say in the video is technically false, but they leave out a lot of details about Lincoln that you need to know.
Right.
When Abraham Lincoln came to Washington in March of 1861, following his election as the 16th President of the United States, he had no thought that the country would soon be embroiled in a costly and bloody civil war. The slave states of the South had threatened secession in the past and always pulled back. This time, Lincoln believed would be no different. He was open to accommodation if it would avoid armed conflict, but he was unshakable on one point. Lincoln insisted that secession was a constitutional impossibility and that he was obligated by his presidential oath to defend the integrity of the United States.
Okay, so here's where we're going to stop first. So, according to this, Lincoln had no intention of engaging in war. Now, one thing I should also say is when it comes to the study of history, there's always going to be disagreement, specifically because we cannot know what was going through the minds of historical figures. I can't tell you for sure what was going through Lincoln's mind when he took the presidency. I can't tell you for sure what his motives were in any specific circumstance. All I can tell you is this is what he in fact did. Now let's consider, in light of what he did, what was his true agenda? When Lincoln came to power, did he necessarily want a war? Well, that's debatable. What is clear is, like he said, Lincoln was willing to make concessions, but there were a couple things he was not willing to compromise on. First, when he came to the presidency, he made clear that he had absolutely no desire to put an end to slavery where it already existed in the Deep South. In fact, he argued that he had no constitutional authority to put an end to slavery, which is interesting considering what he did later. He went on to support the Ghost Amendment to the Constitution, an amendment that has come to be called the Corwin Amendment. which essentially would have amended the Constitution and made it so that the federal government would have no power to, it would officially declare that the federal government had no power to put an end to slavery where it already existed. So Lincoln offered, in an effort to avoid war with the South, he offered to permanently enshrine slavery in the South such that he would never have the ability to do anything about it. Kind of interesting for someone who supposedly came to the presidency with the intention of ending slavery. But however, what's interesting is that while he was willing to support an amendment to the Constitution that would permanently enshrine slavery in the South, he was absolutely unwavering on that he had no intention of allowing slavery to extend into the Western territories. So the Western territories of the Louisiana Purchase and beyond, where the United States was now moving into, he was very clear he would not support the expansion of slavery into those territories. And that was, in fact, the Republican Party platform of 1854. No extension of slavery into the territories. Now, one has to ask the question, if Lincoln was in fact morally opposed to slavery and felt that he had a moral duty to stop African Americans from being enslaved, why was he on one hand unwilling to allow slavery? He was willing to risk a war to not allow slavery to be extended into the territories, but at the same time, he was willing to permanently enshrine slavery where it already existed. I mean, Night Shift, help me out here, but I don't really see, is there a moral difference between holding slaves in the Deep South and holding them in the Western territories?
Absolutely not. No. It actually seems more like a double standard, if anything.
Exactly. If you believe slavery is immoral, then there is no difference between holding them in the Deep South and holding them in the territories. So the question then is, why was he, on one hand, willing to permanently enshrine slavery in the South, but refused to expand into the territories? Now, the answer to that, I think, is best explained by Lincoln's economic agenda. Lincoln, by his own statements, wanted the Western territories reserved for white labor and for Northern business interests that he had always served in his political roles prior to taking the presidency. If slavery was allowed to move into the Western territories, it would reduce the possibility that white laborers would move there, because slave labor and even the labor of freed blacks would have driven wages down such that they would have been less likely to move out there. Plus, thanks to the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, slaves in the Western territories would have boosted Democratic representation and reduced the possibility that that the Republican Party could pass internal improvement bills, such as for the Transcontinental Railroad, which we will talk about later on in this video. But suffice it to say, Lincoln did not care about ending Southern slavery. He said he would compromise by permanently enshrining it in the South, but he would not allow it to expand into the territories. But on this second point, Lincoln claimed that the Constitution says no state may ever secede from the Union. Now, here I think it's important to note how history has been told. Virtually everyone who goes to an American public school is taught the South seceded for one reason and one reason alone, and that is because they wanted to preserve slavery. Therefore, their reason for wanting to secede was immoral, and clearly Lincoln had an obligation to hold the Union together. Now, just so that there's no misunderstanding, slavery is grossly immoral. The Confederate States of America was a grossly immoral, tyrannical regime that actually institutionalized race-based slavery, and I cannot defend the CSA as some kind of moral bastion, because it was not. It was every bit as evil as Lincoln's regime. However, just because the CSA was evil in that regard, we have to ask the question, does the Constitution allow a state to secede, and does it make provisions for whether or not any state can secede and for what reasons they could secede? Now, this is something that has been debated very heavily. I understand many people have made very sophisticated arguments on both sides, so I'm not going to argue that all the founding fathers clearly believed in secession or all the founding fathers clearly did not believe in secession. What I can say is this. There are founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson who clearly believed that secession was a right held by the states according to the Constitution. There are founding fathers like Alexander Hamilton who clearly believed it did not. However, and I'm going to post another link here in the chat, we do have links to the actual transcripts of debates that took place during the Constitutional Convention, where this matter was formally discussed, specifically on May 31st, 1787, there was a debate held when drafting the Constitution whether or not the Constitution should delegate to the federal government the power to use force to suppress a state that sought to leave the Union. Now, James Madison, who is himself called the father of the Constitution, said, although it's unclear to me that it's not clear to me whether he thought secession was actually a fundamental right, he did, however, say this: the use of force against a state would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might be bound. In other words, Madison believed that regardless of your feelings about secession, if the federal government were to use military force to keep a state in the Union, very clearly, if you are attacked by someone who is supposed to be your agent, if the federal government being an agent of the states, any state is going to rightly conclude that if the federal government invaded their boundaries, they were thereby no longer bound by any previous contracts, and therefore the position would be moot. Essentially, we can debate whether or not the states have the legal right to secede, but they did agree that it was ridiculous to argue that the federal government had the power to use military force to keep the states in the Union. Specifically, the Constitution says there are two things in the Constitution that need to be noted. It says very explicitly what the powers of the federal government are. It says what the states cannot do. And it says in the 10th Amendment that any power not specifically delegated to the federal government is reserved to the states and to the people. Therefore, if the Constitution is silent on the issue of secession, which it is implied that any state would have the right to secede from the Constitution if they determined that the Union no longer served their interests. And further, I would like you to consider, in any other arrangement, where would you make this argument? If you join a club and then when you join, nothing is said about you have no right to leave, how could anyone possibly argue if you tried to leave later that when you joined, even though it wasn't explicitly said, you had to implicitly understand that you had no legal right to leave? Of course not. And in fact, ironically enough, if you want to follow the link to Lincoln's first inaugural address, he somewhat humorously compared the Union of the United States to a marriage and to secession, to divorce. Now, I thought what was interesting about that is in marriage, specifically a relationship between a man and a woman, it says that is one case where it says very explicitly in the marital vows that you are not allowed to leave afterwards. The vows are till death do us part. Now, does divorce exist in the modern age? Yes, it does. But I thought it's interesting that Lincoln tried to liken the relationship of the states to one another and the federal government to a marriage. And a marriage is one exception, one rare exception where you do have an agreement where it is explicitly stated by both parties when you enter that you cannot leave. But I have to say that I think any argument that the Constitution, on the basis of silence, says that states cannot secede from the Union is doomed to fail. In virtue of the fact that there was no explicit clause saying you can't leave once you join, you would have to have the right to secede. Night Shift, have anything to add there?
No, that pretty much covers it just about exactly. And no, that's very adequate what you're saying. Yeah, and especially with the 10th Amendment not giving any restrictions on, like, what the states can actually do in that regard. Yeah, I would say that even though it's not expressly said that we can't secede, it's not expressly said that we can or can't or whatever. Yeah, you could almost default on that and say, yeah, we could secede. States actually could secede from the Union.
Again, what defenders of Lincoln will say is, well, yes, but the South only wanted to secede because they wanted to maintain slavery, which really, if you study the issue, that's at best an oversimplified way of looking at it.
Right.
The South had, as the video already mentioned, the South had flirted with the idea of secession several times in the decades leading up to this. First and foremost, because of the Tariff of Abominations that was passed in 1829. We know that during Jefferson Davis' inauguration as the first president of the CSA, he specifically stated that one of his greatest grievances, he did not talk about slavery, but he did talk about Northern business interests plundering the South through astronomically high tariffs that disproportionately affected people in the South, which I'm too much now. But the bottom line is Lincoln did not have a moral obligation to hold the states together. He could have, in principle, allowed the Southern states to peacefully secede. Now, incidentally, he also could have said, look, if be free, fine, but you've got to emancipate the slaves. And if you don't, I'm going to invade you and free your slaves. That's a position he could have taken, but it is one that he did not take. And we'll see that. So let's continue here.
So when the Confederates launched their attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, Lincoln called up federal troops and declared a naval blockade of the southern coast.
Okay, not to pose too soon here, but again, we have another important live omission. Another thing that everyone is often taught in school is the South fired the first shots of the Civil War. The South attacked Fort Sumter, which was a federal fort in South Carolina, and therefore the South is responsible for starting the war. Again, not technically false, but it leaves out some important details here. And I would say this. One thing, the most common mistake I see people making when they talk about the history of the Civil War is they conflate the act of secession itself with the Civil War. The first 7 states, or the states of the Deep South that initially seceded, did so in the winter of 1860, right after Lincoln was elected, but had not yet taken the White House. On the other hand, the bombardment of Fort Sumter didn't start until later that year. So there was a great deal of time that passed between the point where the states seceded and the war started. During that time, the CSA dispatched a peace commission to the White House specifically to negotiate with Lincoln. They were open to a peaceful resolution to them being allowed to peacefully secede. Lincoln ignored them. He said he would not even acknowledge that there was such a thing as the CSA. Diplomats from France are offered to independently arbitrate between the two of them to find a peaceful solution. Lincoln ignored them as well. William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, dealings with the Confederate Peace Commission, said explicitly that they intended to vacate Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and Lincoln was repeatedly warned by his top military commanders that any attempt to reprovision Fort Sumter would be seen by the CSA as an act of war. And yet Lincoln did it anyways. Now, does that mean that Lincoln forced the South to fire on Fort Sumter? No, he didn't force them. But what it does go to show is that the Confederates were open to a peaceful resolution, and they specifically offered to pay for all federal property that was located in the South and to pay the South's portion of the national debt as it existed at that time. Much like the American Revolution, which ironically enough was secession from the British Empire, the American colonists did not tolerate British military bases within their borders, and the South, who had now seceded, they certainly were not going to tolerate a federal military base within their borders. Therefore, while it's technically true to say that that the South fired the first shots of the war, this was a carefully manipulated move by Lincoln in an effort to, as he put it, put the South in the wrong in the process, and thereby drum up more support for his cause, specifically among the northern states. Because if you research newspapers in the United States between secession and Fort Sumter, you'll find that there was actually a very sizable portion of the northern population that believed the appropriate course of action here was let him go. And in fact, even I think it's William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous abolitionists, advocates of ending slavery, said, "Good riddance," when the South left. Yet Lincoln deliberately tried to reprovision Fort Sumter even after he had been explicitly told by his military commanders that it would be seen as an act of war. Again, that does not mean that Lincoln forced them to do it. I think, honestly, it was a foolish decision on the Confederates' part, but it's a lie of omission to say the South fired on Fort Sumter, therefore the South started the war. We'll go ahead and continue from there.
The war was on, and Lincoln was completely unprepared for it. Everything went badly at first. A hastily assembled federal army met with a humiliating defeat at the first major battle of the war at Bull Run in Virginia. More defeats followed. But Lincoln stood firm. New armies were recruited, fresh funds were raised through taxes and bond sales, and the naval blockade was strengthened.
Now, interestingly enough, on that particular point, Lincoln refused. It's important to point out Lincoln refused to acknowledge that the Confederate States were a separate nation. He argued there was no such thing as secession, and therefore there could be no Confederate States of America. However, he instituted a naval blockade of the South specifically to stop them from trading. cotton with Europe. Incidentally, that had a lot to do with the fact that one of the federal government's largest sources of income at that time was from tariff revenue on Southern exports and imported goods from Europe. And when he was addressed British diplomats on the subject, he tried to argue that the naval blockade was not an act of war, to which the British diplomat, I forget his name at the time, specifically said, "We're not playing that game. You have instituted a naval blockade of the South, which is in turn an act of war," that there implicitly acknowledges that the Confederate States is its own separate nation at this point. Now, that does not mean that the British formally recognized the South as an independent nation. They had not diplomatically recognized them at that point, but it just goes to show secession is in fact a reality. The South had seceded, and now Lincoln's only option was to either let them go or use military force to keep them in. As soldiers were dying, as civilians were dying, and as the war was going badly, he continued to work to raise more soldiers, which incidentally, he did so with a military draft, the first of its kind in American history. The question remains, if he's going to argue he has a constitutional duty to stop secession, how many American lives have to be lost? How much does the American economy have to be decimated? How much tax revenue and freedom has to be taken away from individual citizens in order to stop other parts of the country from peacefully seceding? This is a calculation that I would argue Lincoln is obligated to consider. Night Shift, would you have anything to add to that?
The number turned out to be nearly 2 million Americans, actually, unfortunately, and about 640,000 of them were soldiers. So that's about the number that the war cost Lincoln and the rest of the country at the time. Now, I did want to add this, that the British and the French actually considered, they actually sent the Southerners supplies and provisions once they could get past the blockade to actually help them. And it was largely because the British and the British Empire at the time and the French did not want like this big unified America to stand. The only reason that they didn't send troops is because they were afraid that the South would get cocky and basically march on Washington and take over and then get a huge unified. Basically, they wanted to break the country up by that action of, sending support to the South. But it was also because they did support the cheap cotton and whatnot. And what I want to add is I kind of am of the same position. I do not, for the life of me, think that the South or the Confederacy of the South, and I've said this in other videos, I do not think they were the good guys. They were definitely not the good guys. There were no good guys in that war. It was either the Union or the Confederacy. It was just two sides of just asshats that were fighting one another. One was trying to break away, the other one was trying to keep them in, but they were both doing some pretty horrible stuff. I mean, the South, especially with slavery, the fact that they wouldn't give slavery up makes them pretty bad in my book. But the Confederacy was also doing some other things. But again, that doesn't make the federal government of the North any better. But yes, basically there was that problem of there weren't really any good guys in that war, and the only allies that the Southerners had were really just trying to get cheap cotton out of them, and they were trying to keep the country separated. So the Civil War itself was really not a great situation for the United States, and it's sad that we could not find a way to avoid it.
Absolutely. And, I would argue that both sides were clearly immoral. I think far more was lost in the long run by the North winning, but we'll get to that near the end of the video. So continuing here.
All right, cool.
Gradually, the military tide turned. In the East, Union forces foiled an attempted invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania at the bitter Battle of Antietam in September 1862. And a second Confederate invasion the following summer was smashed at the Battle of Gettysburg. In the West, a Federal naval flotilla seized the major Confederate port of New Orleans. This was followed by Union General Ulysses Grant's capture of the Confederate citadel on the Mississippi River at Vicksburg. Lincoln saw in Grant a man who had the qualities to bring the war to a finish. In March 1864, he brought Grant to Washington to plan a major new offensive. Their plan was blunt, bloody, and effective. Overwhelm the Confederacy with superior Union firepower.
Yeah, I'm going to play just a little bit more, but remember his statement here. Blunt, bloody, and effective. Yeah, that's all technically true, but he's going to leave out something very important.
Grant pursued it relentlessly, aided by his equally relentless subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman.
Okay. Incidentally, for anyone watching, I see we have 11 people watching right now. Who knows what William Tecumseh Sherman is famous for? I know there is a delay between when I speak and you guys hear me, so I'll wait to see if anyone comes up in the comments here. But getting to what we're saying here, what is something that is important to know, and that this Prager's video does acknowledge, is early on, the war actually did not go very well for Lincoln. The Confederates won a lot of major battles. Incidentally, as an aside, after the first Battle of Bull Run, I think it was General Stonewall Jackson asked Jefferson Davis for 10,000 troops, and he said he would seize Washington, D.C., which he very likely would have done, and very well could have held Lincoln captive and ended the war right there. Jefferson Davis did not allow him to do so, and later on would go on to say that was his biggest regret in the war. Jess Sim says the curse of Tecumseh. Perhaps, no, but that's not what I'm looking for. Basically, he said that the Lincoln's plan here was blunt, bloody, and effective. Yes, it was. And what effectively was it? Basically, Lincoln figured, after they figured out that they were not winning the war with the strategy that they'd been using up to this point, they said, we will do whatever it takes to win this war, even wage war directly on Southern civilians, to the point that we have made war so, and I remember the exact quote, but it comes from General Sherman himself. He explicitly said his goal was to make life for the Southerners so terrible that their only option was to surrender. And wage war on civilians he did. William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea, or Sherman's March to the Sea, as it was called, is perhaps one of the greatest atrocities in American military history. I cannot think of anywhere else where an American general actually allowed his own troops to burn cities to the ground, destroy civilian buildings and factories, burn crops, to the point that the Southern economy was completely destroyed. And incidentally, here's where history gets a little more fuzzy, because history is written by the victor. Obviously, Sherman was never prosecuted for any kind of war crimes, and history is largely written by the winners, the Union. So they paint Sherman in a positive light. The absolute most positive picture of Sherman you can get is Sherman endorsed the warfare against civilians in virtue of the fact that civilians supported the Confederacy, and did not know that some of his soldiers just basically took it too far. They raped women, they burned civilian homes to the ground, they did all kinds of things that would rightly be called war crimes by any stretch of the imagination, and Sherman just simply didn't know about it. That is the best case scenario. There is also evidence to suggest that Sherman was fully well aware of what his troops were doing, and he actually endorsed it because his goal was to strike such fear into the hearts of the Southerners that they would have no choice but to return to the Union. I believe it's the University of South Carolina at Columbia. In their library, they have preserved numerous handwritten accounts of Southern civilians, particularly from South Carolina, Columbia, which was burned to the ground by Sherman and his troops, stating that Union troops were raping women, burning civilian homes to the ground, stealing food and resources. It was one of the greatest examples of government-endorsed rape and murder in American history. To which I say, Sherman either knew about this and was therefore a war criminal, or Sherman didn't know about this, in which case he was an incompetent leader and therefore still a war criminal.
I do want to add, it's kind of kind of a little ironic, but that's exactly during the Revolutionary War. That's exactly what British troops were doing to the American colonials back in the 1700s. So it's kind of ironic that the Union was not only stopping a secession of another nation, but they were also basically doing everything that the British troops were doing to our ancestors during the original Revolutionary War. So I would almost have to quote Harvey Dent from The Dark Knight. either you die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And that's exactly what the Union was doing in that case.
Exactly. And for all the people who say this was all about freeing slaves and about equality for blacks, they are apparently unaware that as Sherman marched through the South, the blacks that he quote unquote freed, he re-enslaved and enlisted as servants for his officers. So
exactly.
So yeah, if I think for anyone who's seen it, Razor Fist, who has a great channel on YouTube, he made a very long video about Abraham Lincoln, and I'm quoting him. He said, "If the Civil War was about freeing slaves, someone forgot to tell General Sherman," and that is definitely true.
Oh my God, that is so relevant. Oh my God, yes.
All right, so continuing.
Lincoln rode the wave of Union victories to re-election in November 1864. On April...
Now on that point, Lincoln was in fact elected in 1864. Now, I'm going to say here the history is more iffy because obviously finding primary sources that can confirm this is difficult. There is at least peripheral evidence to suggest that Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, committed election fraud to ensure that Lincoln was reelected in 1864. I can't prove that. There are historians who would argue otherwise, but I would say in light of a lot of other things Lincoln did, it is certainly not unthinkable, and we'll get to that.
April 9th, 1865, the war finally came to a close, with Lee surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse near Richmond, Virginia. Lincoln rightfully deserved credit for his successful prosecution of the Civil War.
Really? So Lincoln deserves credit for his prosecution of the Civil War. Here we need to get into another important lie of omission. What were some of the things Lincoln had to do, allegedly, to stop the South from seceding? Well, for one, Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus, which the Constitution nowhere allows the president to do. For those who are not aware, the right to habeas corpus is essentially if the government is going to arrest you and throw you in prison, they must first, one, inform you of what you're being charged with, and two, afford you with legal counsel such that you can defend yourself in a public trial against a jury of your peers. Lincoln unilaterally and without any kind of support of Congress or anyone else suspended the right of habeas corpus and essentially started throwing his own citizens in jail if they dared to question whether or not he was correct in his assessment that the South did not have a right to secede. Hundreds of newspapers in the North were forcibly shut down. Lincoln had journalists jailed for criticizing him and claiming he had no constitutional authority to stop the South from seceding. He had anyone who was suspected as being sympathetic to the South was thrown in jail. He had political imported out of the nation. Lincoln was functionally no different than Julius Caesar when he declared himself dictator for life. For a person who initially claimed he had no constitutional authority to do anything about slavery, he certainly had a lot of constitutional authority to do things that the Constitution nowhere gave him any authority to do.
Exactly.
And really, you have to ask the question again. Lincoln said he believed that the South didn't have the right to secede. Okay, fine. Even if I grant that they didn't have a legal right to secede, was he justified in waging a war that killed some 750,000 of his own people, wounded countless others, suspended constitutional rights, had people thrown in jail without trial, instituted a military draft, which ironically enough is a form of slavery.
Right.
And all these other things, all this was justified just to keep the South in the Union. Really? All that loss of life? I mean, what if to keep the South in the Union, he had to kill each and every citizen of the South? Would it have been justified then? I mean, it seems to me, based on what he did, he would have said yes. And the question is, if that is what it takes to stop a state from seceding, what on earth are you fighting for in the first place?
Right.
Now, for the record, the South was no better in this regard. They had people thrown in jail. They had their own people drafted. I mean, they committed many of the same atrocities. I would just say, ironically, the South was less hypocritical in the process since they never said that they were against slavery.
Right. I also wanted to address something that Charles Ball said. Slavery is not immoral. Chattel slavery is immoral. I asked the same thing as a Negro asks. May I ask what the difference is? That's a good question. What is the difference between the two? And I would argue, no, slavery, any kind of involuntary slavery like that, is immoral. It is immoral no matter what. It is a violation of human rights, and it needs to be treated as immoral. So that was what I wanted.
Gunpoint.
Yeah,
to give up the fruits of your labor, you are effectively a slave. Now, ironically enough, every single one of us who pays taxes to the government is a slave. Now, does that mean our condition today is as bad as it was for the blacks living in the South during that time? No, I'm not an idiot. It's clearly blacks living under chattel slavery had worse conditions than we have today. But it does not change the fact that if you are today a taxpayer, you are by definition a slave.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
What is less well known, but nearly as significant, are the major policy changes he introduced even while the war was being waged. For 6 decades, the federal government had been dominated by the Democratic Party and by its suspicion of commerce and manufacturing.
Now that is a careful what he says there. Was the Democratic Party, at least in its form then, against commerce and manufacture? No, not necessarily. They weren't against trade. What they were against was the government monkeying with trade, specifically using astronomically high tariffs to disproportionately plunder the South so that that tax money could then be invested in Northern business interests. That is what the South was opposed to. But now here, he's about to talk about what Lincoln's real agenda was and talk like it was some kind of heroic action. It was not.
Lincoln, however, had come to political maturity in the Whig Party, which favored the funding of transportation infrastructure to promote commerce, a national banking network to create a stable monetary system, and tariffs to protect American industries from foreign competition.
And here we go. This in fact, was Lincoln's true agenda. If Lincoln ever had any inclination to end slavery, he did not care about that nearly as much as he did about the Whig Party agenda. These 3 things. Government subsidies of politically connected corporations, a national bank with the power to print money out of thin air, and protectionist tariffs that protect politically connected cronies that hurt the American people. Let's talk about what each of these things are. Okay, transportation and infrastructure. Lincoln was majorly corrupt in his involvement with the railroads, and anyone who has studied the Transcontinental Railroad knows that it is one of the best examples of government corruption in American history.
Yep.
Night Shift. Have you by chance ever seen the TV series Hell on Wheels?
I wasn't a consistent watcher, but I did watch a few of a few episodes in the first season.
Okay, I recommend to anyone watching, if you want to know what the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was all about, watch the series Hell on Wheels. It takes place immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it talks about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. There is a scene in the series where the head of the railroad company that is being subsidized by the federal government to build the Transcontinental Railroad is reviewing the plans with his assistants. And they show him a map, and they have built the railroad pretty much straight across the Great Plains. And the owner of the railroad company looks at it and he says, "Why did you build the railroad straight? Why didn't you make it diagonal? I was thinking of it more like this." And he makes a motion with his hand that basically shows the railroad going up and down and this way and that and all over the place. And the engineer just frowns and looks at him and says, "Sir, the land is flat. Why wouldn't we build it straight?" And the owner grabs him, slams his head against the table, and he says, "The federal government subsidizes me $16,000 per mile, and he says build it straight." He throws him out of the rail car, says, "You're fired," and then grabs the next engineer and brings him up. Well, in that one statement, he just pointed out why this whole system was corrupt. Basically, at the time the Transcontinental Railroad was built, there was no market demand for a railroad that connected the East and West Coast. Now, would there eventually be a market demand? Yes, there would be eventually, but at that time, there was no market demand. The federal government had to forcibly tax the people against their will and then subsidize politically corrected corporations to build this railroad. And those corporations then went on to deliberately build it in a too long and inefficient fashion just so that they could pocket more money for themselves. The whole endeavor was a horrible example of government corruption, not to mention the fact that politicians like Lincoln and who were in bed with these people basically conducted insider trading. They knew from the railroad companies themselves what towns they were going to route the railroad through. They would buy stock in those towns and then when the value of the stock went up because the railroad was routed through there, they made a ton of money. It is not an example of the government making America better. It is an example of stealing from the population to make politicians and their politically corrupted cronies richer. And as a final point, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mention, it was also Lincoln trying to have a go at the South. He was actually trying to get at the South because there were plans to do a transcontinental railroad before the Confederacy seceded and before the Civil War. Now, in the North, they wanted the transcontinental railroad built through, the northern states, but in the South, they wanted it built through the southern states. They actually wanted the South to have that. Well, during the Civil War, basically, in case whatever happened in the war, during the Civil War, during this costly war, Lincoln actually started building the Transcontinental Railroad to, again, slight the South and basically say, ha ha, we're doing this first and we're going to beat you to it no matter what the results of the war are, which is why we have the company Union Pacific. It literally is the Union and linking to the Pacific. It literally is that, but that was the company of the Transcontinental Railroad. And it was real. I mean, and you're right. There was no demand for it back then. Would there have been eventually? Yes, there would have. But there was no demand for it back then. But it was what Lincoln wanted to do to have a go at the South. And so that's a really interesting point that Lincoln. It's like he was making. It's like he was making petty decisions. He was very much making petty decisions, even during the war itself. And it was just like. It's like my dick is bigger than your dick, sort of. It's basically dick measuring, sort of, and it was unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. And as a final point, later on, James J. Hill, a railroad entrepreneur, would build the Great Northern, another transcontinental railroad in the North. He would do it without government subsidies and much more efficiently and effectively than the federal government's subsidies ever would. So to claim that the Transcontinental Railroad is some kind of victory of Lincoln is ludicrous. Point number 2, the National Bank. Do you like all the inflation we're suffering today? Be sure to thank Abraham Lincoln, because what eventually would become the Federal Reserve is a policy that was wildly supported by Lincoln throughout his entire presidency. Now, is Lincoln responsible for the Federal Reserve? No, that would not happen until 1913. But Lincoln is one of the ideological progenitors of what would eventually become the Federal Reserve.
Right.
Which is essentially a means for which the government can print money out of thin air, and in doing so cause inflation, which is a tax on the population. Make no mistake, it is a wealth transfer from the people to the government, and further, it is a regressive tax because it disproportionately affects the people who have the least amount of money. And of
course, it was a way for the government to control money, and it was a way for the government to control monetary means, so they would have more control over people's lives. So there is that too.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, tariffs. Yeah. For all the talk about how the Civil War was about slavery, I'm not gonna deny it. Southern secession was in very large part about a desire to maintain slavery. But the reason modern historians focus so heavily on that is to distract from the fact that the South already had a huge beef with the North about protectionist tariffs that disproportionately led to the enriching politically connected northern corporations, while disproportionately plundering the South, who, because of their economy, had to buy far more imported goods and had made more money off exporting goods, in particular cotton, which meant that Southerners were paying disproportionately high amounts of federal taxes, which were then being spent on northern business interests. Again, the South was an evil regime that supported slavery. They were not the good guys. But on this particular grievance, they were absolutely in the right. Why should they stay in a nation where they were having their money forcibly taken from them to pay for other people's interests? I would argue that if that was the sole reason for the South seceding, then they were definitely justified in seceding.
Also, I've got to ask, I might be wrong on this, correct me if I'm wrong. Weren't these tariffs also more or less a form of taxation without representation?
Yes, because not to say that the Southern members of Congress did not have a vote. I mean, certainly there was a great deal of debate that took place. But if you research the history of the Civil War, well before the Civil War came up, I think it was 1829. One of Lincoln's political mentors, Henry Clay, supported what came to be known as the Tariff of Abominations, which was a sky-high tariff, unlike anything that had ever been seen up to that point,
Oh yeah.
that would have disproportionately affected the South. The Southerners were so mad, particularly John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, that they threatened to nullify the tariff and, if necessary, secede from the Union. Ultimately, the tariff was lowered in this regard, and that came to show that at least up to that point, secession or the threat of secession was a check against the expansion of federal power, something that Abraham Lincoln functionally put an end to with the Civil War.
Yeah.
As president, Lincoln signed legislation that implemented all three of these new directions.
And he was not a hero for doing
along
this.
with his plan to create a transcontinental railroad, set the stage for the great industrial expansion of the United States during the last 3 decades of the 19th century.
As we've already explained, the Transcontinental Railroad is not an example of a government success. It is a government. It is a government failure. It is an example of politicians and politically connected cronies enriching themselves at the expense of the American people.
Yeah, exactly.
And on January 1st, 1863, he issued his Emancipation Proclamation that declared free all the slaves of the rebel Confederacy.
Yep, that last line is most important. Remember, at January 1st, 1863, the war is not over. At this point, in fact, it actually looks more like the Confederacy is going to win. And Lincoln is beginning to fear that if they make any more victories, nations like England and France may diplomatically recognize the South and come to their aid. So he then issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which, if you actually read the text, says very explicitly, slave states that were still in the Union, like Missouri, Confederate territories that were currently under Union occupation, like New Orleans, slave states like West Virginia, they all got to keep their slaves. Slaves were only freed in territories that Lincoln did not at that point control. So tell me, how is the Emancipation Proclamation slaves when it explicitly only frees slaves in territories that Lincoln does not control?
It's cherry picking. It's basically just cherry picking the whole thing.
Exactly. The point is the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. It was nothing but toothless posturing on Lincoln's part. Basically, people have argued for a long time what Lincoln was trying to do with this. I can never know for sure what was going through his mind. I think it is my opinion that by Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the best explanation. He was trying to accomplish 2 different things. One, he was trying to bring the slavery issue front and center because he knew that there was an increasing possibility that England and France were going to come to the aid of the Confederacy. He wanted to try and say, if you come to the aid of the Confederacy, you're coming to the aid of a slave state. And England and France had at that point both ended slavery. So it wouldn't have been a good look for them, given they had already ended slavery. And 2, given the war was going so poorly up to this point, I think part of him hoped that the slaves within the Confederacy would rise up and try to overthrow their masters, thereby giving him a military edge. Again, can I prove that's really what was going through his mind? No, but I would say all other things being equal, that makes the most sense to me.
Exactly. Yeah.
So for being the great emancipator, Lincoln never once actually freed any slaves. Granted, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution at the end of the war, which effectively did end slavery, that was unquestionably the one good outcome of the Civil War. But it's interesting that Lincoln really didn't support freeing slaves until the very end. In fact, from the beginning, he was willing to permanently enshrine slavery in the Constitution to stop secession. He was extremely explicit from the start until the day he died. He did not invade the South with the intention of ending slavery. He invaded with the intention of stopping secession, and he was more than willing to permanently enshrine slavery in the Constitution if only the South would have stayed.
Right.
This was the precursor to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in early 1865, forever outlawing slavery in the United States. In all of these labors, Lincoln displayed astonishing resilience and humility in the face of both loss and victory. "I shall do nothing in malice," he wrote in 1862.
"I shall do nothing in malice." What do you call suspending habeas corpus, deporting your political opponents, and throwing thousands of your own citizens in jail without trial for the crime of criticizing your administration?
Also,
is there anything more filled with malice?
Yeah, no. I get that. But also, is Prager U quote mining here? I would suggest to everyone watching this, look up the full quote. I shall do nothing in malice, but look up the full quote. Look up everything that Lincoln said. And if that's all that he said, okay, fair enough, fine. But I would say look up the quote because it seems to me like Prager U might be quote mining this one. Just saying.
Absolutely. Like I said, all you have to do is read Lincoln's collected works, and the only conclusion you can walk away with is that Lincoln was a white supremacist who believed blacks were inferior. And although he was against slavery, although he claimed to be against slavery in principle, he had no intention of keeping blacks in the United States. He wanted them all deported back to Africa. He didn't want them to be enslaved. He wanted them to be free outside his backyard. Which, in fairness to Lincoln, that was not an uncommon view in his day. Most people in the North were just as racist as people in the South. The people in the North were against slavery, but not out of any kind of genuine concern for black people. It was out of economic concern. They didn't want black labor taking their jobs away.
Right. Exactly.
He was true to his word. By the start of his second term, the first of any president since Andrew Jackson, Lincoln had mastered every aspect of his office. The old man sits here, his personal secretary, John Hay, marveled, and wields like a backwoods Jupiter the bolts of war and the machinery of government with a hand equally steady and equally firm.
Now, in fairness to that quote, I will say this. Lincoln was nothing if not a master politician. He was certainly very good at what he did. The question is, what did he do? And the answer to that is he completely disregarded his constitutional oath, much like Julius Caesar, effectively declared himself dictator and used military force to achieve his ends, even when the very Constitution that he had sworn an oath to did not allow him to do so.
Right.
His public addresses, especially his dedication remarks at the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg in November 1863, and his second inaugural address, rose to levels of eloquence that no other president has matched. Sadly, Lincoln had little time to savor his triumphs. On April 14, 1865, only 5 days after Lee's surrender, a fanatical Southern partisan, John Wilkes Booth, shot Lincoln from behind while the president was watching a play at Ford's Theater in.
And what did John Wilkes Booth say right after he shot Lincoln? Sic semper tyrannis, which in Latin means thus always two tyrants. You can call Booth a fanatic if you want, and I am certainly not an advocate of assassination in principle, but I'm just going to say if there was a president who deserved to get shot for being a tyrant, Lincoln is definitely up there.
Oh, yeah.
Incidentally, there are men throughout history who would echo Lincoln's actions. Adolf Hitler would take a playlist out of Lincoln's book. Mussolini, Vladimir Putin. These are all people who behave much in the same manner that Lincoln did, and we call them
absolutely.
Why?
In Washington, Lincoln died the next morning without regaining consciousness. All the world mourned.
I struggle to say that the Southerners who had their homes burned to the ground and seen their women raped by Sherman's troops mourned Lincoln's death.
Right.
I'm Alan Gelso, author of Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, for Prager University.
All right, and that gets to the end of the video. So before we end here, though, I want to say a few words about my asking the question. Okay, we agree. Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant and a terrible person. And fundamentally, he changed the course of American politics. Prior to this point, there was the prospect of a state seceding from the Union served as that's not to say tyranny hadn't occurred in the American Republic already. It had. Right. But the prospect that states or the people of the states could secede from the federal government if it ever became too tyrannical was still alive and well and a check against the expansion of federal power. Right. Through his actions, Lincoln effectively changed the nature of American government. It was no longer a confederation of sovereign states, but rather a monolithic central state. The concept of states' rights was essentially destroyed and the federal government declared supreme over all. Lincoln set the stage for presidents like Woodrow Wilson to bring about the Federal Reserve Bank. He set the stage for presidents like FDR's New Deal to greatly expand the power of the federal government and make it, give it the power to control wages and corporations and greatly monkey with individual liberties. He set the stage for Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and welfare and the war on poverty. He set the stage for Barack Obama's race baiting and government getting involved and white supremacy. All these things are the ideological heirs of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. So yeah, slavery was horrible, but let's not pretend for a second that what Abraham Lincoln didn't lead to a lot of horrors and government overreach of federal government power.
Right.
So I'd like to ask the question. The South was indeed evil, make no mistake. But what would have happened if the South had been allowed to secede peacefully? Now, truthfully, we can never, this is not something we can investigate empirically. You can't go back and change history. So we can never know for sure what exactly would have happened if the South had been allowed to secede peacefully. However, I would submit a couple of things. Had the South been allowed to secede peacefully, yes, slavery would have continued. But you also remember, at that point, the North no longer would have had any obligation to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, which means that the operations of the Underground Railroad would have become immensely more effective. Prior to the Civil War, the small population in the North of true abolitionists, people like Lysander Spooner, who genuinely were against slavery on moral grounds, they were freeing maybe 1,000 blacks per year. But once the Fugitive Slave Act, once the North no longer had any obligation to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, their operations could have been much more open and effective, which means more slaves would have escaped. This means that in the South, Southern plantation owners would have had to start spending a lot more money on enforcement. They would have had to hire armed soldiers and people to stop their slaves from trying to escape. But as economists like Thomas Sowell has pointed out, once this occurs, this is basically the economic end of slavery. Because once the slaves figure out that freedom is within reach and they can try to escape, the cost of enforcing slavery becomes so high that they eventually are out. Whatever money you're making from slave labor ends up getting poured into enforcement. And for that, and then slavery just dies, economically speaking, because you realize you're better off just paying people to work than paying people to enforce slavery. So exactly. I do not believe, as like many people who support Lincoln's actions say, if the Confederacy had been allowed to secede, slavery would have persisted for decades. I honestly don't think that's true. I think that given the fact that the North no longer would have had any obligation to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and the increased cost of enforcing slavery, I find it doubtful that it would have persisted more than, I don't know, I'll be generous, 50 years. I seriously doubt that it would have lasted longer than that. Further, it would have set an important precedent in American history, that being the federal government cannot overstep its bounds. If it goes too far, the states absolutely have the right to secede, and the threat of secession would have served as a powerful check against, I mean, think about it. Things like the Patriot Act, the war in Iraq, and the 20-year waste of war in Afghanistan. What kind of effect on American government might there be had states threatened to secede over those issues? We'll never know. But it's something that Lincoln fundamentally crashed. So, again, I cannot be clear enough about this. The Confederacy was an evil regime. It was horrible that they wanted to maintain slavery. Slavery is a horrible and immoral practice. But that does not mean that anything and everything Lincoln did was justified. In fact, I would argue he caused more harm than good.
Right. And honestly, I would say this. I actually had a conversation with Mikhail the Stray Cat on his channel about this. And there was he had a guest speaker. I forget their name. I'm really bad with remembering names. But they were this person was basically known as the constitutional philosopher. And they basically read all the different states' constitutions. And they brought up a very interesting point. If you want to see what kind of damage Abraham Lincoln did and what kind of things, that he was responsible for, especially on the secession front, on states' freedoms, just look at a state constitution or just read a state constitution that was written before the Civil War, like maybe Virginia's Constitution or South Carolina's Constitution or something like that, and then read a post-Civil War Constitution like my state's Constitution, like the state of Idaho, and you'll see that there are major differences between the two, and it actually looks like states like Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and whatnot, they actually, their constitutions are are much better and make them much freer, as opposed to states like Idaho, California, Arizona, which were written after the fact and basically are very restrictive and do enforce a lot of federal control as compared to the other ones. So if you want to see the damage and if you want to see the tyranny that was inflicted by Lincoln, look no further than pre-Civil War states' constitutions as compared to post-Civil War states' constitutions, and you'll see plenty.
All right. Well, thank you, Night Shift, for coming aboard the stream. We've just passed the 1 hour mark. Thank you to everyone watching. I am going to put this last quote up here from the Fine Libertarian. Lincoln also set the precedent for the income tax. It was repealed after the war, but it came back in World War I, and it was as permanent as a temporary government program. That is correct. Again, I would say Woodrow Wilson was an ideological heir to Lincoln. Lincoln changed us from the government. The government has only those powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution, to the government has all powers not explicitly forbidden to it by the Constitution. Or, in fact, in wartime, as Lincoln put it, he can basically do whatever he wants. Wilson picked up that mantle. FDR did as well, and many presidents have done since. So, at the end of the day, God bless John Wilkes Booth, Semper Tyrannis.
There you go.
And that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth.